What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Atom RPG. Now, right off the bat, if you're new to my channel, I like to review games after 100% to set myself apart from other reviewers on YouTube. My Steam profile is linked in the description below where you can check achievements and everything. However, reviews after 100% do cover more than just that. If you're new to the channel and you click on the channel, the first video you'll see is a video explaining it and everything that I cover. Atom RPG itself, however, is a very prominent indie cRPG. And prior to this, I had only messed around with it in passing. I checked it out a little bit when its standalone expansion, True to Grad, launched. But the base game of Atom RPG launched at the tail end of 2018, I believe it was December 19th. And has since seen a ton of post-launch support, getting an update as recently as a few weeks ago, actually. That said, the core content of the game is complete, and most of what they update now is things like localizations, etc. But what is Atom RPG? Well, essentially, it is a Fallout-like, where we are looking at an alternative world history where instead of taking place in America, we take place in a post-apocalyptic USSR. Because in this world, the Cold War ended in nuclear annihilation rather than what happened in real life. Now, this particular review will be mostly spoiler-free. You might see one or two things in the footage here or there, but generally speaking, I'm not going to cover anything too spoilery, but we are going to go over the story setup, and then I'm going to mix up my format a little bit. But starting with the story setup, we will be making a character who belongs to the Atom organization. This is a sort of paramilitary organization that has operated since the fall of the world, which it's important to note that the game itself actually just takes place in 2005, and the apocalypse only happened like 15 years ago, which means this is all relatively recent, and a lot of the people alive in this world were alive pre-apocalypse. Now, the Atom organization is largely just trying to get things back up and running, if you will, bringing humanity back to normal in many ways. But that's their big goal. You specifically are sent out to find an expedition team that has went missing, and that basically colors the rest of the story. Now, a few notes on the story itself. Overall, I thought it was pretty good. It has some twists and turns to it. I don't think anybody's going to give it a huge award in that regard by any means. However, I thought it was pretty decent. I will say, though, however, depending on your actions in-game, it is very possible that you will find yourself out of leads about how to advance. And while I was never able to break the story in any way, in a sense that the game was no longer completable, you can oftentimes find yourself with no real leads or information about how to progress. And this can even happen unintentionally, which is a bit frustrating. That said, again, none of this will actually break the game, because if you know where to go for the ending, you can actually just go straight there at the beginning of the game. All it really requires is for you to go to a specific place in a specific place. And knowing where that is, you can just go there whenever. And because of this, the game, again, never really becomes uncompletable in any way. It does lack a certain cohesion here and there, which can be frustrating. But from there, let's talk about what, in my opinion, for this game is actually the most important part, and that is difficulty and combat. Normally, I talk about this stuff a little later, but I want to talk about it more at the beginning here simply because I feel like knowing this stuff is paramount to knowing everything you need to know about this game, honestly. So first of all, difficulty. When you create your character, you're going to be given a difficulty option. It's important to understand that the difficulty in this game is largely meaningless, because in terms of combat, etc., it's actually all the same, outside of survival. On survival, there's permadeath, so if you die, you're dead. It's like an Iron Man mode. However, in every other regard, it's basically just expert mode. Expert and below are functionally all the same. What changes is that the lower the difficulty is, the more you are rewarded for what you are doing, in terms of experience, money, and ability points, which we'll get into later. However, I will tell you that outside of ability points, the difference was negligible. The amount of ability points you get on lower difficulties was actually pretty substantial, because you get 3 per level instead of 1 per level on expert. But beyond that, it's all basically the same difficulty. Now, from there, let's talk about combat a little bit. This is essentially a clone of Fallout 1 and 2. And as such, this is a turn-based action point system where you can swap between 2 slots in your inventory to allow you to switch between weapons or other items to interact with the world with. All of these actions, movement, etc. cost action points that you'll use until you're done, and then it passes the turn. but there are some very important things to note even within this system. First of all, dexterity is king. This is because dexterity, as an attribute, grants you your action points. So it's important to have at least 10 dexterity, although 11 is the maximum, because 10 dexterity is going to give you 10 action points, which is the amount of action points every enemy in the game is going to have. And as such, having less than 10 dexterity is actively hindering yourself. Moreover, dexterity increases your dodge, which will help you avoid attacks if you aren't wearing a lot of heavy armor. And then from there are two very important skills when it comes to combat. And I would say, obviously, you want to increase your weapon skill that you are using. So if you're using automatic weapons, you want the automatic weapon skill to be raised. But that's a given. Outside of that, there are two that are really important, and that is stealth and survival. Stealth is paramount. No matter what you're doing, your character should have at least some points in stealth. And this is because what stealth actually does is reduces enemies' detection radiuses. Unlike Fallout, there is not an active stealth system. You do not activate stealth. What stealth does is reduce the range at which enemies will engage in combat with you. And having a decent stealth score will mean that in a lot of cases, you can just walk around encounters. And if you get ambushed on the world map, it's very possible that you will be able to skip the encounter simply because combat won't start when you get thrown into the encounter because you're not close enough to the enemies for them to detect you and start combat. Survival is pretty important because until you get your car, it dictates how fast you move along the world map. And secondly, survival is your chance to evade encounters on the world map. So survival, combined with stealth, can make it almost impossible for your character to be ambushed, which is a pretty big deal on the higher difficulties, especially the Iron Man mode survival. But from there, let's actually talk character creation a little bit. Now, this is essentially a clone of Fallout's special system. We are going to pick our attributes. They can be anywhere from 1 to 11. I would say taking anything to 11 instead of 10 is usually pointless. Then we have all of our various skills, most of which are weapon skills. And then we have our distinctions. Distinctions are a benefit for a detriment sort of thing, much like traits from Fallout. And while there are a lot of good opportunities for role-playing here, there are unfortunately a few things that can be done to really just push the game in your favor. For instance, the personality attribute. There are personality checks in the game. However, almost all of those are relegated to seducing someone, which, unless you want to do that, is mostly useless. There are a few checks here and there where it can help you out, but by and large, having one personality isn't really going to hurt you. It will reduce your starting speechcraft, but you can still put points into speechcraft, which will raise it up, and then will allow you to pass the much more common speechcraft skill checks, which will prevent you from really losing out on much in terms of content. So as such, you can usually dump personality. Luck can be very helpful in some situations. However, it is also mostly ignorable. If you want to take it down to 1 to spend all of those points somewhere else, you can. And while you certainly don't have to do that and the game is completable otherwise, it is nonetheless incredibly helpful to do so because this is going to allow you to max out things like dexterity and intelligence. Dexterity giving you all of your action points, like I mentioned. Intelligence actually giving you more skill points per level, which is going to turn you into a powerhouse of a character very, very quickly. Now, the skills themselves max out at 199. However, you're going to stop seeing a benefit to most of them around 150. And with max intelligence, you're getting about 25 skill points a level, which means it's very easy to quickly max out several of your skills, especially the ones that started out kind of high to begin with. Now, this turns into a bit of a weird situation in terms of actual gameplay, because the game is fairly challenging until you hit around level 10 to 15, depending on your build. At which point, it kind of flips a switch and your character just starts destroying everything, as long as you had a cohesive build in mind. For instance, my first run of the game was actually pretty difficult because I wasn't really min-maxing. I was just trying to do a little bit of everything I wanted to do. And then for my second run on a harder difficulty, I very specifically made a sniper build, knowing where a lot of the items were, and probably around level 6 or 7, with the help of some distinctions that made it almost impossible for my character to miss as a sniper, I just started killing just about everything in like 2 hits, combined with stealth, allowing me to just skip encounters, or in some cases, kill half the enemies before combat even started. And on that second run, I absolutely wiped the floor after like level 5. Now, the other part of character creation that isn't actually presented at character creation is the ability trees. So as you level up, you are actually given ability points. Your first ability costs 1 point, and every ability after that increases in price by 1 ability point. On Expert and Survival, you only get 1 point. On Normal, you get 2 points, and then on Easy, you get 3 points per level. So on Easy, you can immediately get 2 ability points because it's 1 and then 2. So on the lower difficulties, you get more abilities, whereas on higher ones, you're only ever going to have access to so many. But these abilities can be very, very strong. But for the most part, there's one for each weapon type, and then a sort of defensive tree. So if you really line these up with your build, you can get very, very strong, like I mentioned. But from there, let's actually talk world building a little bit. Now, functionally speaking, this is pretty much identical to Fallout 1 and 2, like I mentioned. You will travel around a world map to the individual maps. You even get access to a car a little later in the game once you're able to go get it. And while the survival skill will make your character travel faster on the world map, once you get the car, that's kind of irrelevant. But while you're traveling and traversing the world, you do have to keep up with the hunger mechanic, which got honestly pretty tedious. But beyond that, in terms of the world building, the important thing to remember is that you are in a post-apocalyptic USSR, so a lot of the world building kind of revolves around that and kind of talks about prominent figures around the Soviet Union and how the world has been coping in the face of the apocalypse. Now, in that regard, settlements are very much so starting to rebuild, which I thought was really cool because post-apocalyptic games like to focus on the post-apocalypse, whereas in this game, there is a very clear, cohesive effort to normalize society, even just like 15 years after the event. And we see several large towns with an attempt at governance even, which I thought was a nice touch. Now, the other side of the world building is that it kind of leans into Fallout 2's approach of a lot of pop culture references. You can find a guy shouting about crypto even. There's a lot of secrets that, again, just kind of reference pop culture. You can find some Cthulhu mythos type stuff, etc. And honestly, just a lot of the stuff that Fallout 2 was known to do. And while it's kind of funny to see, it does kind of make the game feel like it takes itself a little less seriously as a result. So take that for what you will. Now, beyond that, the last thing I wanted to mention about world building is that it is a relatively small world if you kind of know where everything is. On a first run through, it can be actually seemingly pretty large in scope, but once you kind of know where everything is and know how all the quests kind of flow together, you can very quickly kind of run through this world and get your characters up to speed. And while the initial world map isn't the only area of the map, there are 2 other smaller world maps that you can travel to. And I do mean small, like a couple of areas in them. I mention it because at the end of the day, this is an indie RPG for $15. And while it does punch well above its weight, it's important to remember in terms of the scope of this title, it is fairly small once you kind of get a feel for everything. Now, beyond that, let's talk companions a little bit. There are 4 potential companions, and I would tell you, much like the original Fallout, they're mostly just there to have someone to travel with and help you in combat. They do have dialogue. They can talk to you a little bit. One of them is kind of important to the main story. He's another Atom organization member that you're told to go find right at the beginning of the game. However, he can die, which is potentially one of the ways your main quest lead can get lost because he has to tell you something, or can potentially tell you something, I should say, that is intended to help you out. But beyond that, they're all just kind of there. There's a dog companion, of course, and then there's a couple other guys, but again, they have small stories, but they're mostly just there to help you in combat. It's important to note that there's no romance with companions. However, your character does have the opportunity to seduce quite a few people throughout the game itself. And these are mostly just one-off encounters. There's not like a proper romance built into any of them. So if that's your thing, I would expect it to be more of a sexual conquest adventure rather than any proper romances in that regard. With that said, let's talk positives, negatives, and wrap this thing up. So on the positive side, this game is impressive for an indie RPG, honestly. This game punches well above its weight. And considering that, again, you can buy this game for $15 on Steam, it is an impressive amount of content here. And honestly, an impressive amount of options for role-playing built into it. While this might not be a positive for everyone, I did enjoy it in that it was a very faithful spiritual successor to Fallout, if you will. In many ways, playing this game feels like playing what was intended to be the original Fallout 3. Now again, that was a positive for me. However, on the flip side of that, if you wanted this game to advance a lot of mechanics, etc., I wouldn't really expect it. This game very much so leaned into trying to be just like Fallout 1 and 2, And as a result, outside of the setting, it's not really any different from those games, all the way down to the actual gameplay mechanics. Now, on the proper negative side of things, as I mentioned, the game is unintuitive in quite a few places, just in terms of how it functions, how the main story progresses, and while it never outright breaks the game, it definitely breaks the flow of the game, and can leave you, the player, just kind of meandering around, trying to figure out what to do next. Now, in a world of online guides, you're probably just going to look it up, but the fact that you even have to look up how to continue the main story isn't a great look. And then the other negative for me was that while the skills in general do have a pretty solid representation across the game, there are, again, just a few very specific winners that after playing for a while, you can tell the game is heavily weighted towards. Stealth, survival, dexterity as an attribute, the intellect attribute actually even. You can tell that the game honestly is much easier to play if you go in that route. And as such, that can leave some players with specific builds feeling frankly underwhelming as a result. Because again, the game is heavily weighted towards the playstyle that I've mentioned earlier. That said, let's draw a conclusion. Now, as I've already mentioned, this game is $15 on Steam for what is likely going to be a minimum 30-hour adventure for you. And that's just with a single playthrough. If you want to see everything, you're likely to spend a lot more time with it than that. But ultimately, while the game is a little janky in places, you can definitely tell it's an indie title in a lot of places, but nonetheless, the game punches well above its weight. And for just $15, the game is a pretty tremendous value, and as such, I would definitely recommend people pick it up. Now, with all of that said, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. The channel is growing every day, so with that in mind, if you liked the video, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.